Hello, welcome back. Yes, so now we'll kind of look at the narrative and the photograph. So, photography is a very kind of specific space in that it captures just a slice of time, as opposed to novels, plays, comic books, music, all those sorts of things. There's a much kind of larger external time sequence in those types of narrative or those types of texts than there are in the actual photograph. So it's a very different kind of space, and just wanted to kind of explore that kind of relationship between the photograph and narratives. And I also wanted to kind of just talk about the limitations of the photographic medium and how kind of connected to text it is in terms of captions, titles. When you see it in advertising, you have slogans. So the photographic space is also a space that is able to be recontextualized because of certain limitations in its nature. So I just want to look at this Marie Ryan quote, which it seems clear that of all the semiotic codes, language is the best suited to storytelling. Every narrative can be summarized in language, but very few can be retold through pictures exclusively. Since pictures left by themselves lack the ability to articulate specific propositions and to explicate causal relations, their principal narrative option is the illustrative mode. So one of the kind of quotes that I've read over the years is that language is the kind of text, is the language of description, and that images are the language of representation. So it's how those two come together. Again, it's almost like story and discourse in a way. Those two different language types come together. There's also the notion of that the photograph can't say aren't or not or can't. So it can't show a negative purely in the image itself. So there's kind of things to kind of think about as we move through. So the image is seen as another way of is not seen, as as another way of telling the narrative, but as a means of evoking it or recalling the story from memory. Narrative images have a symbiotic relation with the verbal, as they import psychological motivations, emotions, and characterizations from the main story. And that's an important thing to remember about the photographic narrative and the photographic space, is that it evokes from a memory. Okay, so it kind of takes parts of the past or parts of our own our own experiences, and that's kind of the things that we kind of read. It has a symbiotic relation with the verbal, in that most photographs sit next to text in terms of how they kind of get contextualized. They don't kind of exist in many ways without text. They exist in this very kind of amorphous space where they can be characterized and contextualized in many different forms. But once they are contextualized with text, then that kind of meaning starts to become a lot more locked down. So it's a interesting space where images and especially photographs kind of sit. So one of the ways in which photography has been kind of seen in narrative, or seen as a way of representing time, is the notion of the pregnant moment. So the pregnant moment essentially comes from theatre where they were talking about where every aspect of the narrative comes together in one point. So, so we ask ourselves what has happened, what is about to occur, and where we are in the sequence of 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 a narrative, and that's kind of where the pregnant moment sits. Now, a very famous photojournalist called Henry Cartier-Bresson then kind of took that idea of the pregnant moment and called it the decisive moment. And that for many years was this notion that the idea, especially within photojournalism, is to capture the moment where action has just kind of occurred or is about to occur. So this kind of implication of a much bigger event from here on in, and that's the actual photo of the plane about to hit the second tower. It's this very famous photograph of the man about to kind of walk into the puddle. There's the sense of the past in that you can see the ripples in the puddle where he has kind of walked to get to the point where he is. There's the implication of the future, of him getting wet and being kind of wet within that kind of space. But this image has captured the second just before that kind of event. There's no talk of who this man is, why they're kind of doing this, what their past, what that person's past is, and what led them to this kind of point. So, if we were then kind of given a textual response about why this person is about to kind of jump into the water, then we start to kind of feed more from that image. But it needs to kind of be related in some particular way. So Cartier-Bresson kind of talks about the decisive moments where the past, present, and future of the story can be read, summed up at a glance. So it's this one particular moment, the decisive moment in any human interaction. So you almost sit there and you wait until just before someone kind of is about to get punched, or something's about to happen, or in the Robert Capa image. Oh, I forgot to change the bloody caption. I'll do that later. Where the soldier has been shot. That's the decisive moment. So you can kind of see that they're kind of running down the hill and they've been shot and they've been pushed back. There's a lot of contention about that image, whether it's actually true or whether it's kind of made up. So, but Robert Capa was trying to kind of capture that decisive moment, which very much comes from a painting, from a historical painting kind of point of view, where we kind of see these. Where we see events like this Caravaggio painting with David with the head of John the Baptist. So it's just after that head has been kind of removed by sword. So that's kind of where this idea has kind of come from. But one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is also the idea of frames and scripts. So this is a newer kind of way of reading narratives within photography. It takes its history from a lot of cognitive psychology. Also looks at a lot of AI technology, like how do robots move within space, and what should artificial intelligence kind of do within a particular frame and script. So it kind of looks at human movement in these sorts of ways of frames and scripts, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later. But you can kind of see how once we kind of get to the end, you can kind of see how artificial technology or artificial intelligence uses these ideas in terms of how they kind of develop their robots moving forward. If anybody has got a design background, they would have heard of Gestalt Theory. So this also is a very much a precursor to the notion of frames and scripts. It's where Gestalt Theory kind of came from the idea of how how individual notes, when they're played together, form a symphony or form a song. So there was a lot of research done in the early 1900s about how how the brain takes individual data, individual dots and dashes, individual notes, and then starts to compose that into something that kind of makes sense. Do you know what I mean? And we don't listen to music through individual notes. We listen to it as a whole. We listen to it as a whole thing. So that then kind of looks at how do we kind of see information. So such as dots, dashes, or colors or designed letters, we bring those together as a whole. So it's not like we see when we see a picture, we see every aspect of that picture, and then we bring that together as one thing. We don't see them separately. We try and bring them together. We try and make connections. The brain tries to make connections between all these different elements. All right. The use of Gestalt meant that separate objects shown together will be perceived as being part of a whole, as opposed to being read to what they are, which is outside the construction of the image. And it's very interesting to think about how the brain actually kind of does that. Excuse me. So there's this image by Paul Sapura Mapaji, who's a African American photographer out of Los Angeles. Kind of shoots him and his partners and his friends through this kind of grubby mirror. So there's various kinds of components within this image, and I kind of wanted to show you that, where you have the figure, you have the mirror, you have the camera, you have the tripod, and then we kind of our brains piece it together that what we're looking at is a reflection of a mirror, but we can see the surface of the mirror. We can see Paul kind of setting the camera up and looking through and shooting that. So we kind of piece together all these various parts, and then we kind of make a whole out of that. And that's where it gets quite fascinating for me, is how the brain puts all these things together to try and form a narrative. The brain always wants to make sense. It never depending on the type of person, for how long you want to sit there and try and work it out. But we're always trying to piece things together to try and form relationships, and that's something that as artists that we can really play with, is this notion that the brain is always wanting something to become a whole. Okay. All right. So now we're kind of going to the specifics of frames and scripts. So frames are essentially static situations, such as the arrangement of the walls, ceilings, and objects that populate a room, such as a stove, refrigerator, and dining room table that form a kitchen. So if you think of the notion of a kitchen, there are certain things that make up that space. So, a fridge, a stove, maybe dining room table, counter, all those sorts of things. So when we see those things together, so if we see a picture and it's got a refrigerator, it's got a stove, it's got a table, it's got a bench top, our brain goes, that's a kitchen, because we know the frame that makes up a kitchen. That's kind of something that throughout all our lives, we've kind of come to understand that those elements pieced together form a kitchen. The Candida Hoffa image here too, all of those elements come together, and through our own experience, we realize that it's a hall, a very regal, very royal kind of space, very wealthy. Kind of all of those things come together through our own experiences, and we make those assumptions based on our past. So other things you can kind of think about is, if you kind of shoot inside a hospital, and there are certain kind of aspects within that we know belong in a hospital, you don't need to put underneath you don't need to write a piece of text saying this is a hospital. We know that it's a hospital. there are certain ways of telling that certain images are shot in certain places, and then we know not only do we know that it's a kitchen, but there's an expectation of the events that occur within that space. So there's an expectation that within that kitchen you'll be making food, that you'll maybe kind of be I'm talking to people, but you're in that space to do you're in that frame to do a certain script, which is eating or cooking. Okay, so scripts. Scripts are sequences of action that are standardized and performed and repeated by varied individuals, such as using a fork to stabilize food, a knife to cut the food, and a fork to transport the food into the mouth. There are certain scripts that we follow every single day, and that we know those scripts, like eating, brushing our teeth, putting our clothes on, and the spaces in which we do that. You know, if you're putting your clothes on, chances are it's not going to be down this park where I am now. It's going to be in like a private space. So there are aspects of the script and the frame that come together for us to kind of make sense. But it's when those two things perhaps are separated that then we kind of start to think, oh, okay, what is kind of happening here? So this Polly Ball and print, these adults are dressed up as babies, performing kind of infantile actions. So she's making a point about this isn't necessarily the script that should be with this frame, and the only difference is that we can see that they're adults. So how they're dressed is childlike, how they're acting is childlike, but the characters within it are adults. So the script has been changed, and the script is now different. Okay, so that's kind of how these sorts of frames and scripts can come together. So narrativity occurs in the interplay between what is expected through the standardized action in scripts and then what is portrayed in the image. For a narrative to have tellability, to be worthy of being told, it must contain a recognizable script, but also include a departure, surprise, or deferment from the script. So nobody wants to watch a narrative of somebody just brushing their teeth, because we all know that frame, we all know that script. That's not something that has, in inverted commas, tellability. However, if in the middle of brushing your teeth you realize that, maybe your flatmate has kind of put it up their bum, then that then has kind of tellability, because it's outside of the recognizable script. Or that perhaps when you're brushing your teeth, then maybe the house gets shot up or something else happens that is unexpected. So whenever you're thinking about a narrative, you have to kind of think about it as more than just what is expected. What is it about this? What is it about this? What is it about what normally occurs within this frame? And how can I then disrupt the script that normally happens within that frame? And it's a really kind of interesting way to think of your own work. It's like if you're just documenting your pets, and we've seen a million photographs of people's pets, how are you disrupting the script for the representation of your pet? How are you disrupting the script of how we shoot a birthday party or a wedding? Because one thing about being at university and being art school, it's about trying to rewrite those scripts, about trying to make new ways of seeing these events. And I'll just show you kind of the one image from Charlie White, who kind of has a normal, very, very normal looking, cocktail party. It's somebody, on the right there, poking someone's belly to see that they're pregnant. Everything in there makes sense except for the naked alien talking to the young girl. So that's the way that he has disrupted what is a very standardized script. The frame of the living room is known. The way that people are dressed and talking is a known way of having a cocktail party. Going outside, seeing people are eating, some people are drinking, people have kind of, serviettes with finger food. Everything within that frame and script is entirely recognizable and normal, except for the disruption of the naked alien. Okay, so that is the kind of disruption of the actual script that we're kind of interested in the way that kind of a narrative then starts to form, and an interesting narrative starts to form, are these disruptions of the norm. And the very last slide of today is that narrative occurs not in the sequence of events, that is in the text itself, but in the interface, the interplay between text, viewer, and reader. And that's really important. So narrative and interesting narratives and interesting stories and interesting ways of kind of viewing the world and showing the world. It's not necessarily just in the story itself, but in how that story is told, and then how the interplay between the the way the image is supposed to be told, between the text, the viewer, and the reader. The reader is the same person. So it's that interplay between all of those different kinds of things. And this Catherine Opie image here, where she's kind of etched a childhood story onto her back, I think is such a beautiful, poignant, and painful way of kind of talking about that interplay between the text itself and how we view it, because we view this very childlike drawing that has been etched into the flesh on a woman's back. So it speaks about violence, speaks about childhood violence, speaks about long-term trauma, but it's still shot in a very childlike way. So the frame of the woman's back is disrupted by the script being etched into her kind of back. So they're the things that we're looking at in terms of you making work that kind of extends on our ways of viewing and seeing the world and having interesting narratives. Thank you very much.